The mockery in the spotlight, the clinking of crystal glasses and the low hum of refined conversation filled the grand ballroom of the Elysian, a Manhattan landmark that only the wealthiest could afford to frequent. The chandeliers above glittered like captured constellations, their golden light pouring over marble floors polished so perfectly they reflected the movements of everyone who passed. The air smelled of truffle butter and aged wine, the kind of scent that lingered on tailored suits and silk gowns long after the evening ended. It was a banquet that reeked not just of wealth but of power, people who shaped markets, who shifted economies with the flick of a pen, who thought of cities and countries not as communities but as investments. At the center of it all sat Victor Callahan. Victor was the kind of man who seemed to own the very space he occupied. His navy tuxedo fit him as if it had been tailored with the same precision he demanded from his employees. His laugh was too loud, his gestures too sweeping, his presence too heavy for comfort, and yet nobody dared call him out. He was a billionaire CEO who had built his empire in global shipping and logistics. A man who could shut down entire trade routes with a single decision. His face had appeared on countless magazine covers, usually with a confident smirk and a headline about disruption, innovation, or dominance. He thrived in attention. He thrived in admiration. And tonight, he had both in abundance. Around Victor's table sat bankers, investors, and venture capitalists, each hanging on to his every word as though proximity to him might elevate their own fortunes. They laughed when he laughed, nodded when he spoke, and smiled in anticipation when he paused. Every story he told, whether about a competitor's collapse, a negotiation he crushed, or a risky venture he turned to gold, was received with admiration. But beneath the polished surface, Victor's personality carried a cruel edge. He didn't just entertain, he cut. He found amusement in highlighting the faults of others, in showing everyone how easily he could belittle someone less powerful. It was this part of him that would soon collide with someone he never expected. Across the room, weaving gracefully between tables, was Naomi Carter. Dressed in a crisp white blouse and black apron, she carried a tray balanced effortlessly in one hand, her steps measured and deliberate. Naomi was 26, her hair coiled into a neat bun, her expression calm and focused. To most in the room, she was invisible, part of the background like the flowers arranged on the tables or the polished silverware. Her job was to serve, to remain unnoticed except when needed. But Naomi was far more than her uniform suggested. She had once been a university student with dreams of working in international relations, fluent in 3 languages, including Arabic. But life had not been kind. Her father had passed unexpectedly, leaving the family with debts that forced her to put aside her education and take whatever work she could find. Tonight she was a waitress, moving silently among people who would never guess her potential. Victor's gaze followed Naomi as she approached his table with a tray of wine glasses. He smirked, his eyes narrowing with the kind of interest that was less admiration and more predatory curiosity. His companions noticed, leaning in as if expecting him to entertain them again. Victor had a habit of turning the staff into the subject of his humor, and tonight Naomi had caught his eye. "Careful with that. Sweetheart," Victor said in English, his tone dripping with false charm that carried an undertone of condescension. His words made a few at the table chuckle softly. Naomi, professional as ever, set the first glass down with steady hands. She offered a polite nod, her expression unchanged. But Victor wasn't finished. He leaned slightly toward his companions, his voice lowering but not enough to remain private. In Arabic, he muttered a phrase laced with insult, something crude about her appearance and her place in the room. His companions laughed more freely this time, their amusement feeding off his arrogance. To them, it was harmless fun. After all, what were the chances a waitress in Manhattan understood him? Naomi heard every word. She didn't flinch. Her steps didn't falter. She placed another glass down with the same precision, her face composed, her movements graceful. Inside, however, a fire lit in her chest. She had heard men like him before. Men who assumed her silence meant ignorance, who assumed her uniform made her less, who assumed her skin and her job placed her beneath them. But Naomi was not beneath anyone, and she wasn't going to let this moment pass. Victor leaned back in his chair, his smirk broadening, convinced his little performance had gone unnoticed by its target. He lifted his glass, waiting for the ripple of laughter to settle, basking in the small victory of humiliation delivered so easily. But when Naomi placed the last glass on the table, she straightened, turned her head just slightly, and looked him directly in the eye. Her voice was calm, steady, and flawless in Arabic. "Respect is the price of true wealth," she said, her tone carrying the weight of quiet authority. "And it seems, sir, you cannot afford it." The room froze. At first, the laughter at Victor's table stuttered to an awkward halt. Forks paused halfway to mouths, glasses hovered in the air. Conversations at nearby tables fell silent as people turned, sensing something had just shifted. For a heartbeat, the entire grand room seemed to hold its breath. Victor's smirk faltered. He blinked, caught completely off guard. The words hit him like ice water, sharp and humiliating. His companions exchanged uneasy glances, their amusement draining into discomfort. Nobody had expected this. A waitress had just flipped the script, answering back not in anger, but in poise and in the very language he had used to demean her. Naomi didn't linger. She gave a slight nod, collected her tray, and walked away with the same composure she had shown since the beginning of the night. She didn't need to say more. Her reply had landed like a stone in still water, the ripples spreading outward through every corner of the room. Victor tried to laugh, forcing a sound that rang hollow and strained. "Well, she's full of surprises, isn't she?" he said, attempting to recover his dominance. But his tablemates no longer laughed with the same ease. Their eyes followed Naomi as she moved across the room, their minds replaying her words. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone knew it. For Naomi, it was just one moment. A moment where dignity demanded she speak. She returned to her duties, pouring wine, clearing plates, moving silently as though nothing had happened. But for Victor Callahan, that moment was the beginning of something he could not control, because moments like these don't stay contained. They ripple, they spread, and soon the man who had mocked would realize that one careless insult could cost far more than he ever imagined, and the woman he underestimated would prove unforgettable. The ripple effect. The banquet continued as though nothing unusual had happened, but the air had changed. Conversations no longer flowed with the same easy rhythm. Victor Callahan, usually the loudest presence in any room, had grown uncharacteristically quiet. He swirled the dark red wine in his glass with a little too much force, his smirk replaced by a thin line of irritation he tried to disguise as indifference. His table companions, men who only moments before had roared with laughter at his crude joke, now stole quick glances at one another, uncertain whether to resume the old performance of admiration or maintain the silence that stretched uncomfortably between them. The weight of Naomi's words lingered, unshakable like smoke clinging to silk. Across the hall, Naomi moved through her duties as though the exchange had been nothing more than routine. Her face carried no trace of triumph, no sign of anger, only the calm professionalism that she had perfected over years of working in service. Yet within her chest her heart beat hard. She knew what she had done was risky. Waitstaff were not supposed to challenge customers, especially not the wealthy ones who wielded power like weapons. A lesser manager might have fired her on the spot for daring to disrupt a guest performance of superiority, but Naomi had not been able to let the insult pass, not when it was so blatant, not when it relied on the assumption that she was invisible, incapable, beneath them. It was not the first time Naomi had been underestimated, and it likely wouldn't be the last, but it was the first time she had chosen to push back, to lift her voice in a room designed to silence her. And even though she kept her expression neutral, inside she felt the tremor of something stirring, something like pride, something like defiance, something like the first spark of a fire that could not easily be extinguished. The staff noticed. They always noticed. While guests pretended that servers and waitresses were little more than shadows moving between tables, the staff themselves existed in a kind of shared awareness, an invisible fraternity forged by the daily grind of service. The moment Naomi's Arabic reply had cut through Victor's smugness, several of her co-workers exchanged quick glances in the corners of the room. One of the younger waiters nearly spilled a bottle of champagne in his astonishment before catching himself. Behind the bar, the head bartender's mouth twitched into the faintest smile before he bent back over his glasses. They said nothing. Staff, in a place like this, learned quickly to keep their reactions hidden, but Naomi's quiet. Rebellion had not gone unseen. What neither Victor nor Naomi realized in that moment was that they had not been entirely alone in their exchange. Among the guests that evening was a woman named Diana Caldwell, a journalist for one of the city's leading financial magazines. She had been invited to cover the event for a feature on Manhattan's new generation of power players. Diana was the sort of journalist who noticed things others dismissed, the subtle exchange of glances during a negotiation, the tension behind a forced laugh, the cracks in a polished persona. And tonight, from her seat 2 tables away, she had noticed the waitress's reply. She hadn't caught every word, but she had caught enough. She saw the way Victor's smugness faltered, the way the laughter around his table died into awkward silence, the way the young woman's eyes carried both composure and steel. Diana's instincts flared. This was a story, perhaps not the kind she had been sent to write, but one that revealed more about the man at the center of Wall Street's circles than any polished interview ever could. She made a mental note to follow up, to learn more about this waitress who spoke fluent Arabic and had just humbled a billionaire in front of his peers. Victor, for his part, refused to acknowledge the unease gnawing at the edges of his performance. He forced his voice louder, more commanding, telling stories about his most recent business conquests with theatrical flourishes, as if sheer volume could erase the silence that had followed Naomi's words. Some at the table laughed again, though the laughter carried a strained edge like music played off key. Victor's eyes flickered once or twice toward the staff moving across the room, but he never let them linger on Naomi. Inside, however, he seethed. Never in his life had someone in her position spoken back to him, let alone in a way that undermined him in front of his inner circle. It wasn't just an insult. It was a fracture in the image he had so carefully constructed. Victor lived on dominance. He thrived on being untouchable, on the assumption that nobody dared contradict him. And now, thanks to a single sentence from a woman carrying a tray, that illusion had been punctured. He made a private vow that before the evening was over, he would put her in her place. Naomi didn't dwell on it. She continued her work, moving from table to table with grace. But as she moved, she felt eyes following her. A man in a silver suit gave her a curious look as though trying to place her. A woman in pearls whispered something to her companion while glancing in Naomi's direction. She wasn't used to being noticed, and though she maintained her composure, she felt the weight of the attention pressing against her. She hadn't meant to draw a spotlight onto herself. She had only meant to defend her dignity. When the banquet finally began to wind down, the last course cleared and the guests drifting toward the doors, Naomi retreated to the staff corridor to breathe. The hum of the main hall faded behind her, replaced by the clatter of dishes and the chatter of kitchen staff. She leaned against the wall for a moment, closing her eyes, letting the tension ebb from her shoulders. A fellow server, a young man named Miguel, approached with wide eyes. "I can't believe you did that," he whispered, glancing nervously toward the door. "I thought for sure he'd snap at you." Naomi opened her eyes, her lips curving into the faintest smile. "Sometimes you have to remind people that respect goes both ways." Miguel shook his head in admiration. "You've got more courage than anyone in that room." Naomi didn't reply. Courage hadn't been her goal. She had spoken out of necessity, not bravery. But she could already feel the ripples of what she had done, and somewhere deep down, she knew this moment was only the beginning. As the night ended, Victor left the banquet hall with his usual entourage, but the air around him was different. Conversations were quieter, less reverent, laced with subtle doubt. Investors who had once hung on his every word now glanced at one another with guarded expressions. A seed had been planted, one that would grow in ways he could not yet foresee. And Naomi, exhausted but steady, stepped into the cool night air after her shift, unaware that her words had begun a chain of events that would soon shift the balance between them entirely. The turning point: by the time the sun rose over Manhattan the next morning, the city was already humming with the rhythms of ambition. Wall Street brokers flooded the subway in their pressed suits, skyscrapers lit up like modern temples of money, and the pulse of the city beat in fast, relentless strides. In Victor Callahan's penthouse suite overlooking Central Park, however, the morning felt different. For the first time in years, Victor awoke to something he did not control, whispers he could not silence. At first he thought it was nothing, a careless remark at dinner, an awkward silence that would be forgotten by morning. But as he scrolled through his phone, sipping his first espresso of the day, he froze. Someone had recorded it. A 30-second clip was spreading online, filmed from a shaky angle across the banquet hall. It wasn't crystal clear, but it was enough. The video showed him leaning back with smug arrogance, speaking words that needed no translation for the tone to be understood, followed by Naomi's calm, flawless Arabic reply. The moment when laughter turned to silence was captured perfectly, and the internet, always hungry for stories of arrogance punctured, had latched onto it with lightning speed. Comments piled beneath the clip on social media. This is what happens when the rich think they can walk over people. Who is she? Absolute queen. Respect costs nothing, but apparently even billionaires can't afford it. By noon, the clip had been viewed hundreds of thousands of times. By evening, millions. Bloggers were dissecting it, influencers were sharing it, and even mainstream outlets began to mention the incident at the Elysian. Victor's carefully crafted image of invincibility was suddenly being mocked in the language of memes and hashtags. Victor slammed his phone onto the counter, the espresso sloshing over the rim of its cup. "This is nothing," he told himself aloud, his voice echoing in the empty apartment. "It will blow over." Yet a pit of unease gnawed at him. He had weathered scandals before, angry unions, environmental lawsuits, whispers of unethical practices. But those had been battles he fought in the boardroom or in court, places where money and lawyers gave him control. This was different. This was personal, public, and utterly human. Meanwhile, in a much humbler apartment in Harlem, Naomi sat at her small kitchen table, staring at her own phone in disbelief. Overnight, her world had shifted. She hadn't even known the exchange had been recorded, and now she was staring at herself on the screen, watching her own calm words replayed again and again. Her hands trembled slightly as she scrolled through the comments. Strangers from across the globe were praising her composure, her courage, her dignity. She had never been the center of attention before, and the sudden intensity of it left her both stunned and unsettled. Her younger sister, Camille, leaned over her shoulder, wide-eyed. "Naomi, you're famous," she exclaimed. "Look at this. People are calling you the waitress who humbled a billionaire." Naomi shook her head, setting the phone down as though it might burn her. "I didn't do it for attention," she murmured. I couldn't let him disrespect me like that." Camille grinned, unbothered. "Well, whatever you did, the whole world noticed. Maybe this is your moment?" Naomi wasn't so sure. She had no desire to be a viral sensation. What she wanted was dignity, security, maybe a chance to return to the education she had sacrificed. Yet as the hours passed, her phone buzzed with messages, friends reaching out in awe, coworkers sending her screenshots, even strangers somehow finding her contact information. Among the flood of noise, one message stood out, an invitation. The email was from a cultural organization that hosted an annual event celebrating diversity and global understanding. They had seen the video, they explained, and they wanted Naomi to speak at their upcoming forum. The theme this year was Voices of Respect in a Divided World. Would she consider sharing her story? Naomi stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. She had always dreamed of engaging with international communities, of building bridges between cultures. Her studies in Arabic and diplomacy had once been the path she thought her life would take, before bills, debts, and family responsibilities forced her to trade that dream for double shifts and service trays. Now, out of nowhere, the world seemed to be offering her a glimpse back into that abandoned path. But fear tangled with hope. Could she really stand on a stage and speak to an audience filled with scholars, leaders, and activists? She was just a waitress. What would they think if she stumbled? What if she wasn't good enough? That night, Naomi sat in her bedroom, the city lights glowing faintly through the window, her laptop open to the invitation email. She hesitated for hours, the cursor blinking over the reply box. Then she remembered the look on Victor Callahan's face when she had answered him in Arabic, the flicker of shock, the collapse of arrogance, the silence that followed. She remembered the way it had felt, not just to defend herself, but to remind an entire room that dignity could not be bought or silenced. And slowly she typed, "Yes, I would be honored." Far uptown, Victor's night unfolded differently. His phone had not stopped buzzing all day, but the messages were no longer filled with the sycophantic praise he was accustomed to. Several investors had called, politely but firmly, to ask what had happened. A board member suggested that he release a statement of apology. Even his own public relations team urged him to get ahead of the story, before it spiraled further. But Victor's pride was volcanic. To admit fault was unthinkable. "I don't apologize to anyone," he barked at his team over a late-night call. "Especially not to a waitress. This will pass." But his team wasn't so sure, and neither were the circles that once orbited him without question. For the first time in years, Victor Callahan was not the one controlling the narrative. And somewhere in the city, Naomi Carter, the waitress he had mocked, was preparing to step into a role that neither of them could have imagined just days before. The fall of a giant, the rise of a voice. The night of the cultural forum arrived with a sense of anticipation that seemed to hum in the very air. The auditorium, lined with golden lights and velvet curtains, filled quickly with business leaders, scholars, community organizers, and journalists who had heard whispers of the waitress who had stood up to a billionaire and left him speechless. Naomi Carter stood in the wings, her palms damp, her heart thudding so loudly that she thought it might echo into the hall before she even stepped onto the stage. She was no stranger to hard work, no stranger to carrying trays heavier than her own body weight, no stranger to being overlooked and dismissed. But standing before an audience of influential men and women who waited to hear her voice, this was new territory. And yet, deep down, she knew she wasn't just speaking for herself tonight. She was speaking for every person who had ever been mocked, dismissed, or made to feel small. When her name was announced, Naomi took a breath that felt like it carried all the years of silence and stepped into the glow of the spotlight. For a brief moment, the light blinded her and the audience blurred into nothing more than shapes and shadows. But as her vision adjusted, she saw the rows of attentive faces, and her fear shifted into something sharper, steadier, conviction. She began not with a booming voice, but with calm honesty. She told them about the night at the banquet, about the words spoken in a language Victor Callahan assumed she could never understand. She didn't retell it for pity, nor for spectacle, but as a mirror held up to arrogance. Then her voice grew stronger as she spoke of dignity, of respect, of the quiet strength in those who serve silently, unnoticed, while the powerful feast. She wove her story into something larger than herself, painting the lives of countless workers who were too often overlooked, who carried worlds on their backs without applause. As she spoke, the audience leaned forward, the air taut with attention. Every word rang with sincerity, not polished rhetoric or rehearsed theatrics, but the kind of truth that pierces because it is born from lived experience. Naomi recounted how she had learned Arabic not to impress anyone, but because she loved understanding people, cultures, and stories different from her own. She explained how knowledge and respect were bridges while arrogance only built walls. And in that moment, she wasn't a waitress telling a story. She was a voice giving form to every quiet injustice endured behind closed doors. By the time she paused, her throat tightening with emotion, there was not a whisper in the hall. And then, slowly at first, then swelling into thunder, the applause erupted. Meanwhile, Victor Callahan sat in his penthouse office miles away, watching the live stream on one of his many screens. His jaw was tight, his fist clenched so hard against the armrest of his chair that the leather creaked. He had thought the noise around Naomi would fade quickly, swallowed by the next scandal or gossip headline. But now she was on stage. Her voice amplified, her face remembered, her story spreading like wildfire. Investors he once commanded with arrogance were now sending him terse messages questioning his judgment, questioning his behavior, questioning whether they wanted to be tied to his name any longer. Victor's empire, built on fear and power, suddenly seemed fragile, like glass spiderwebbed with cracks waiting for the final blow. For the first time in decades, he felt the chill of uncertainty. The next morning's headlines sealed the shift. Photos of Naomi at the forum spread across newspapers and digital platforms. Articles didn't just call her the waitress who answered back. They began to call her the voice of dignity, the unexpected leader, the woman who turned arrogance into accountability. Journalists clamored for interviews. Community groups reached out to her for collaborations, and even universities began offering her opportunities that once seemed far beyond reach. And in parallel, Victor's world narrowed. Stockholders distanced themselves, sponsors withdrew quietly, and his name became less synonymous with power and more with disgrace. What stunned Naomi most wasn't the sudden attention, but the messages she received from ordinary people. Strangers wrote to tell her that they had endured years of being dismissed by bosses, mocked for their accents, or treated as less because of their jobs. They thanked her for standing tall, for answering back not with rage but with strength and dignity. Reading those words late at night in her small apartment, Naomi wept softly, overwhelmed by the realization that her moment of courage had rippled outwards, touching lives she would never meet. She had been afraid that speaking up would only make her life harder, that she would be crushed by a giant too powerful to fight. Instead, her truth had become a shield and a torch for others. And yet, Naomi didn't let the newfound attention sweep her away. She still reported to her shifts at the restaurant, still carried trays and greeted guests with warmth. But something was undeniably different now. The regulars looked at her with respect instead of indifference. Her coworkers carried themselves with a little more pride. Even the managers, who once ignored her suggestions, now asked for her input. Naomi's act had not only shifted her own life, it had begun to change the environment around her. In the weeks that followed, Victor Callahan tried desperately to reclaim his narrative. He issued half-hearted apologies, hired spin doctors to paint himself as misunderstood, and even attempted to stage charity events to prove his goodwill. But the public wasn't fooled. Every move looked desperate. Every gesture rang hollow compared to the authenticity Naomi had displayed. The world had seen the arrogance behind his mask, and no amount of wealth could buy back the dignity he had thrown away with a single careless remark. By the close of that month, Victor's empire had shrunk considerably, his influence dimmed. Naomi, on the other hand, stood taller than ever before. She was invited to more forums, asked to contribute to discussions on respect in the workplace, even approached by organizations seeking to support her ideas on education and equality. But perhaps the most remarkable moment came when she was invited back to the same hall where the infamous banquet had taken place. This time, however, she didn't carry a tray. She carried herself. She was no longer a waitress in the room, but a guest of honor seated at the table. The reversal was stunning. Those who had once ignored her now leaned in to hear her opinions. The same chandeliers that had glittered above her while she had been mocked now gleamed above her, as applause rang in her honor. And while Victor Callahan's name was mentioned only in whispers of caution, Naomi's was spoken with respect, admiration, and hope. Legacy of respect. The weeks that followed Naomi's forum speech unfolded like a slow but steady sunrise. What had begun as whispers of admiration now expanded into a movement of recognition, echoing far beyond the banquet hall and even beyond the city. Naomi Carter, once invisible in her black uniform carrying trays through glittering crowds, became a symbol of something larger. The quiet dignity of those who labor in the shadows and the power of a single act of courage to tear down walls built by arrogance. Invitations continued to pour in, but what struck Naomi most deeply were not the headlines but the handwritten letters that arrived at the restaurant where she still worked part-time. Letters from single mothers working double shifts, from immigrant taxi drivers mocked for their accents, from young students balancing studies with menial jobs. They all said the same thing: "You made me feel seen." Those words carved themselves into Naomi's heart and became her compass. Naomi's life began to transform in ways she could not have predicted. A prominent university that had once denied her a scholarship reached out, offering her a full ride to continue her education. Nonprofit organizations sought her insight, eager to involve her in building programs for worker dignity, multilingual education, and cultural understanding. Even government officials requested her participation in roundtable discussions about labor rights and respect in the service industry. Each invitation humbled her, but Naomi remained steady. She reminded herself that she hadn't spoken out for fame, nor to strike a blow at Victor Callahan. She had spoken because she believed people deserved better, because silence would have meant surrender. And so she chose carefully, aligning herself only with opportunities that allowed her to uplift others rather than inflate her own image. Meanwhile, Victor's world was unraveling piece by piece. His face once dominated magazine covers and business headlines, but now he appeared only in articles analyzing his decline. Investors who had once worshipped at the altar of his wealth now turned their backs, wary of his toxicity. Lawsuits crept into his empire, allegations of mistreatment from employees emboldened by Naomi's courage. Deals slipped through his fingers like water, and each desperate attempt to repair his reputation only underscored his fall from grace. At galas and summits where his presence had once silenced rooms, now whispers replaced applause, pity replaced fear. Victor had built an empire on arrogance and cruelty, and now he stood in its ruins, learning too late that wealth without respect is a hollow crown. The true turning point came months later, when Naomi launched the Carter Foundation for Dignity and Education, an initiative focused on providing scholarships and mentorship programs for young workers, particularly those in service industries. At the launch event, she stood not in an apron but in a deep emerald dress, her presence luminous beneath the soft lights. Behind her on the screen, the foundation's mission glowed. Every voice deserves to be heard. Every life deserves respect. The applause that followed was not just for Naomi, but for what she represented, a shift in values, a reminder that kindness could be revolutionary. Naomi looked out into the crowd that night and spotted not just powerful leaders, but also waiters, janitors, cooks, and drivers whom she had personally invited as honored guests. They were seated at the same tables as CEOs and politicians. For the first time, the lines between servers and served blurred, and the hall shimmered with a rare equality. It was at this event, fittingly, that Naomi encountered Victor again. He had not been invited, of course, but he arrived nonetheless, a shadow of the man he once was. His suit was immaculate, but his eyes carried a dullness, a flicker of desperation hidden beneath practiced charm. He attempted to speak with Naomi, perhaps to salvage some shred of dignity, perhaps to twist her growing influence into something that could serve him. But Naomi met his gaze with calm firmness. She did not gloat nor lash out nor humiliate him as he had once done to her. She simply said, "Respect is not a performance. It is a choice you make every day. Until you understand that, you will always be poorer than the people you mock." Her words were quiet, but they cut deeper than any public humiliation. Victor left without another word, swallowed by the crowd that no longer saw him as a giant but as a cautionary tale. In the years that followed, Naomi's foundation grew, her voice reached new platforms, and her life transformed in ways that would have seemed impossible the night she first carried a tray through Victor Callahan's banquet. Yet she never forgot her beginnings. She still returned often to the restaurant, not to serve but to sit at a corner table with her old co-workers to share stories and remind herself of the place where her courage was tested. And she carried with her always the knowledge that her rise was not built on bitterness, but on the power of respect. She had not sought revenge against Victor. She had sought justice for dignity itself. That difference became her strength. The final proof of her journey came one evening when Naomi attended a gala in her honor. The chandeliers gleamed above her once again, the tables glistened with silverware, and the crowd buzzed with anticipation. But this time Naomi did not carry plates or bow her head. She walked confidently to the center, greeted not as a server but as the guest of honor, her name called with reverence. As she looked around the hall, she remembered the first night, the mocking words, the sting of humiliation, and then she saw how far she had come. The applause that rose in waves around her wasn't just for Naomi Carter. It was for every person who had ever been dismissed, overlooked, or mocked. It was for the power of resilience, the strength of truth, and the unshakable legacy of respect. And so, Naomi's story closed not with a single triumphant moment, but with an enduring truth. Money may buy a seat at the table, but only respect can keep it. Victor Callahan's empire had crumbled into dust, forgotten by those who once worshipped it. But Naomi's voice, her dignity, and her courage had built something far greater. Something that would live on in the lives of countless others. A legacy carved not in marble or gold, but in the hearts of people who had been reminded of their worth.